Welcome to Questions We're Afraid to Ask.
How do we perceive the world? Some of us see it and some of us don't in our memories, right? So how do we remember the world? I was going through something. I was at work, like walking back from lunch and processing something. And I needed to like think about how I was going to do something on the computer when I got home. And it was like a bank account thing. And I caught myself actually doing this, like in the hallway. I was like, okay, here, double click this. And I was using my hand as the mouse pointer attached to the image in my brain and where my hand moved, the mouse was moving. So I was physically interacting with the 3D visual image in my brain. And which is something I do a lot, right? I do that a lot. But then I stopped and I went, my God, Daniel can't do that.
Yeah.
It's not the same. I mean, you could move your hand around as you're telling somebody to do something, but it's not the same. And it just kind of hit me that it's like, man, not only do I have an image in my mind, I have an interactive 3D hologram style thing I can move, shape, and do stuff with in my brain.
Yeah. I mean, at one point, when I was more actively working with the operating system on a day-to-day basis, I did have a working, and it would be literally go here and do this and click this and do that. Like but that was more, I think just rote memory at that point. But yeah, it's been interesting. I've continued to sort of look into aphantasia and do some research, and I came across something called your autobiographical memory. That's what I was looking for. That they were thinking that people with aphantasia didn't have as good of autobiographical memory. And what they're finding is that it's actually not the case. That people that everybody just has bad long-term memory, and people who don't have visual memories just think they don't remember stuff very well, and that basically most people don't remember most of their things very well. And that the one big deficit is that, obviously our memories are less detailed. We don't, when asked for details about an event, it's much more simple, which would sort of make sense if you're not seeing it again.
Yeah. And they talk about that of how not accurate and useful eyewitnesses are, like on a crime. Like memory can degrade and change and that, and I'm not saying that I have like perfect memory by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, on the drive home, I was talking to my friend Brian today, and he was like, "Remember the Star Wars game that we played? Is this one shot thing where we did this?" And I was like, "I have no idea what the hell you're talking about." It was like there was a hole in my head. So it's not that I have perfect memory; it's how I see the memory when I pull it up, or how I see the image I'm thinking about when I pull it up. That is so different.
I mean, there's only so much hard drive storage in your brain. So there are, when I think back to, middle school or whatever, there are key memories, if you want to use the Pixar idea. So that event that he recalled was more significant in some way than it was to you. And so it saved in his brain, and it got dumped with the rest of the stuff.
Yeah, that's the whole bit about the episode of Married with Children, where the daughter can only remember X number of facts, and so they fill. She goes on the game show and they fill her with all the facts about the sports stuff, and then the last question is talking about her dad, and it's fallen out of her brain, and it's that whole concept, which is a great episode. It's a great show. I think anyone who is a younger person, a millennial, or a Gen Z or whatever, go watch Married with Children. It is the most politically inappropriate thing you will ever watch, and you could probably all use a dose of that. So go watch it. It will help you understand those of us who are Gen Xers, right? And our sense of humor. But, it's just, I don't know. I've been thinking about it a lot since we did the episode because,
Yeah.
I'm talking about Married with Children. And I'm using that as a specific example because I'm remembering flashes of it in my brain as we're talking about it, like flashes
Right.
of that episode. Like she was on the thing. And now, and I don't have a perfect image of it because it's been so long since I've seen it, but I can more or less see that like game show stage she was standing on. And I couldn't tell you what color dress she was wearing, but I remember she was like blonde or with the big 80s style, early 90s style hair. And,
But you're also
but I'm
filling
seeing
in
it.
bits of that from all your knowledge of the show as well.
Yes,
So like
absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
that's sort of the interesting thing about the visual memory. It's like, and I mentioned it on the last one. Like I've had many times where I've had people describe a movie to me and tell me about a scene that wasn't in the film. And then I go back and watch it. I'm like, oh, this is the scene they were talking about, but they didn't throw a grenade. Like, where did they get a grenade from? And in their mind, when they think back on it, their brain inserts things, which is why eyewitness is an unreliable witness. But it's interesting that like because my brain files information differently, if I can recall a movie, if I've seen a movie and I recall it well enough, and you tell me about it and you start to embellish, I'll go, oh no, I know that didn't happen because I don't, when you file it, when it just the way my system files, like I can identify, when it goes like, oh, I don't remember seeing that, and if I'd seen it, I would have remembered it, on what it is, and it's just the way my brain stores info. It's weird.
Yeah, and I missed everything you just said. I don't know. I think there's something going on your end.
What do you mean?
Tech wise, like
up?
as bad as like when we had your pastor friend with us the first time.
Oh, yours was doing that before.
Yeah, okay. Well, I don't know if there's something going on here. I don't know if there's just something on the internet. We'll just keep going. But yeah, and then as I work with my oldest, we're running into memory problems, and specifically, like his therapist is calling it executive functioning, right?
Yes.
How do we program him to know the things he needs to do every day? Because he just spaces out and forgets. Yeah. And this all ties in, it's not visual, right? But it does tie into memory and perception. And I'm going to talk about like perception in the moment, because one of the things that we have decided to do is we've got a thing on the refrigerator that's a dry erase board where I can write the list of things. These are the things he needs to do during the day. Do A, B, C, D, or E. And he will walk up to the fridge, stare at it, open it, get the stuff out, close it, and then turn around and walk away. And his brain doesn't even take in the fact that this thing is there, because this was all leading up to him trying to get a job, right? That was the goal. He was trying to work to get a job, and he has a part-time job. But now, in the way his autistic brain functions, he got the job, the task is done.
Right.
So he's now simply, it's not important anymore. So he's just like, I didn't even see it was there. I looked right at it and I didn't know it was there. And that's just, and it's not that it wasn't in the background. It's like his brain just didn't even acknowledge that something had changed because it wasn't important to his worldview that day. And basic things like, we've got him to where he can take his meds every day, which is awesome, but he can't remember to set an alarm unless I remind him. We're working on those kind of things. It's like, why aren't you setting an alarm? Did you brush your teeth? Oh no, I need to go do that. Well, when was the last time you did that? Oh, 3 days ago. And it's not because he doesn't know that he doesn't need to go do it, but it's more than habit. It's necessary tasks that need to be done. And and if he hasn't decided in his brain, in his file system, that they have an importance, they don't flag and retain. And how do we teach that to someone who is not neurotypical, right? Who's neuroatypical?
Well, I mean, you have to be able to. I mean, I'm working on this with my 13-year-old. It's sort of like, I need you to clean up the table, and like that's too big of a task. It's not like he doesn't look at it. I look at the table and it's messy, and I'm going like, all right, well, there's some dishes on the table, and there's some trash on the table, and then there's like, some papers or some magazines, and so in my brain I would go, all right, I'm going to take the trash, I'll put the trash away, I'm going to put the dishes, on the counter, and then I'll take anything else that isn't mine, and I'll sort of make it neat, and then I've cleaned up the table. And for him, that's too, like, he can't start at like where I need. I think the same problem he has is he can't see the goal in his head.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that, Peterson talks about this a lot, about the idea of like, you have to visualize the goal and then have something to look for. And so I think the problem that he runs into, which is something that I sort of am realizing that is like, because I can't see it here where I'm trying to go, it makes it really hard to see like, oh, I have to do, these things to get there.
Yeah. And that's interesting that you bring up that example, because one of the deals is he's not paying rent right now. He's working part-time. Yeah. He's really not making enough money to do it. And I'm trying to teach him these things. And one of his things was clean the kitchen, and he would come out and it's clean. Well, no, it's not. And so what it fundamentally ended up, after the arguing back and forth, when we both finally had a day where we were both there, I was like, all right, we're going to do this together. And we cleaned the kitchen spotless. And I said, now look around. Look at everything. Look at the cabinets over there. Look where the stuff is. Look at what the table looks like. Look at it. So I gave him a finished product.
Yeah.
And since then, he has had a visual reference in his mind of the finished product. Right. So I don't have to go behind him now, and unless I was like, you said you cleaned the kitchen. He's like, yeah, I was lazy. It's not, I don't know where you want me to go, Dad. It's
right.
Either I didn't want to do it, or I ran out of time. I had to go to work, or, but he can get to the point, but I had to show him what I wanted. I had to physically show not only like what it should look like when it was done, but I made some poor assumptions that he knew where things went and how I wanted stuff done. And so we had to, at a very granular level, more so than I would think the typical person would need, I had to walk through it. And it's because, and this is where his visual memory's weird. He sees a closed cabinet, and it's simply a closed cabinet. He doesn't make the logical leap to open the cabinet and see which dishes are in that cabinet, to know where to put the dishes. So that's so it's like, all right, so we're going to open them all up and look at them. And, and now that once we've done that, they're there. Right. So he's got like close to perfect recall, but doesn't make the leap to, I should open the cabinets and see, are these dishes, or are they glasses, or are they plates, or are they pots, or, because he'd be like, where does this go? And I'd say, figure it out. And he's like, how?
Right.
Well, open the stuff and look. All of them? Yes, all of, it's just, and so those are some of the executive functioning things that we're struggling with. All this comes back to like how our brain works, which is fascinating.
I've been thinking about that now that as we're talking about it, that as well. I don't remember not knowing how to do these things, and so like I wonder if I'm just assuming, because like I'm sort of thinking now, like I do remember when my dad like explained to me how to do the laundry or whatever, like there, and so and maybe I haven't explained things well enough.
It's possible, but I learned through. I also don't remember. but I remember seeing my parents do it and being expected to do it with them.
And I think
And
the
I picked it up that
difference
way.
I think the difference is all the kids now are on screens all the time, or at least a lot of them, and they're not paying attention to what's going on around them. And I
That's a part of
wonder
it.
if
That's a part of
I
it.
wonder if that's why we're starting to see people not know who they are, is because they're not picking up the social cues that they're getting from the box, aren't registering correctly. They're either the box is giving bad social cues, or the way that the way that they're getting those interactions isn't right, and they're not paying attention to what mom and dad are actually doing and how they're functioning in the world. They're just so narrowly on the little thing.
Yeah, because I make a point of making my youngest like turn it all off. Let's learn how to clean your room, and we taught him how to clean his room.
Yeah.
And to be perfectly fair, he's got way too much crap in his room. Too many toys. He's got too much stuff.
So does my daughter.
And so it was a matter of like organizing and showing him how to organizing and teaching how to do it and those kind of things. And I don't know. I get, and I think maybe it's a cultural thing, because the way I learned to clean, and I know we've shifted away from visual memory, but the way I learned to clean was like at least once a month, the doors open, and we had the screen door open. We opened the windows, especially during the spring and the summertime. This is when I really think about it in the fall. And we had the big radio, the tall stereo that had the record player, and then the amplifier and all the different stuff in it, with the big glass door and the 4.5 foot tall speakers. And we would put on the golden oldies, the 50s music, and crank it up. And then I knew that Saturday was shot for me, because we would start cleaning in the morning and we wouldn't stop until it was done. And it was a family affair. Everybody participated. Everybody. And it was like, all right, we're going to pick all this stuff up, and then everybody's going to start washing the windows, and everybody's going to start wiping down the dust. And you know, it's the dad's doing the vacuuming, and, you know, because it was the only way to get it done. Now, to be fair, my mom was babysitting kids in the house as a profession, so it had to be cleaned, right? I mean, it wasn't just me and my brother and my mom and my dad. There were, you know, during the school year, there were like between 5 and 12 other kids in the house running around, and then so it was a lot of stuff, a lot of dirt getting tracked in and things like that. But that was just a thing, and I never thought about it, never questioned it. But now I'm thinking back, and that's not necessarily how me and my ex-wife did it. Like we would do the cleaning day, but, you know, Rick was always just kind of there, and he wasn't picking it up the same way, and we had to show him real specifically about what we wanted him to do, and then he would like only do just a tiny bit of it, and it ended up being like, all right, Rick, dust the baseboards. And by the time he was finished doing that, we had cleaned like 3 rooms, right? But he could obsess over like one task. So I don't know. We're not talking about visual memory as much in aphantasia right now, but it's just like how the brain works and how we learn things. But how did you learn to clean house? Like, how did your parents keep the house organized or clean? You know, I mean, do you have memories of it?
No, not really. I mean, I remember the point at which my parents, like long after I had moved, I remember the house being cluttered. Like I wouldn't say, I mean, no, we're not talking about hoarders or anything, nothing like
lived in. I call it lived in, right?
Yeah, you know, there are people when you go to the people's houses, and you know the bookshelves are full, and there's, you know, little piles of things around, and it wasn't you know, it wasn't unclean. It was. It
didn't look like a show house, though. It didn't look like a show house, right? It wasn't pristine.
I've never understood that, where you go into somebody's house and you're like, man, like, do you live here?
Yeah. Like, well, and you know what? My ex-in-laws were that way, and it was a point of pride for them for whatever reason, which
And
is
you know
fine,
what?
which is fine.
Yeah.
But they paid somebody to come in like twice a week to clean, and my ex-mother-in-law would spend hours cleaning the house so it was clean enough for the cleaning ladies to come in and clean. Which, you know, and again, I have no idea exactly how they grew up,
Yeah.
but that was a point of pride for them. And
I
there were rooms where if you walked in, they were like my ex-father-in-law's office was a little more like what I would consider cluttered and used and lived in, right?
right.
But big portions of their house, and I never really, I only got to see the house that my ex-wife grew up in like twice before they sold it and then moved to a much bigger, nicer house. And I have a
Mhm.
feeling the house she grew up in, which was much closer to that like 1,400 square foot starter home style house, would have been more cluttered because it felt that way. Like they had the much smaller kitchen and all that. And so I think when they moved
Yeah.
into the bigger, nicer house, and you know, one kid was in college and the other one is high school, they had
They
gotten to the
could
point
have
where they
that.
wanted a show home because they entertained a lot. And I
Yeah.
think that may have had something to, and I understand that because I didn't feel comfortable having people come over to my house for a long time until I finally got the kitchen and the living room and the like guest
Mhm.
slash public bathroom clean enough where now, okay, I feel like I could have people over and they're not going to be like, what the hell is going on? It's not perfect, but I feel like I
Yeah.
could entertain, right?
I had a friend growing up in high school whose parents were very wealthy, and they had a house where like you go in and like the downstairs was a showroom. It had a huge piano and a beautiful. I mean, it was a beautiful. They had New Year's Eve parties at their house every year. It was a beautiful home. Um, actually, I went to some of those New Year's Christmas parties and stuff like that. But like it was. But then you go upstairs and like, oh, people live here. Like he was very, it was the kids' rooms, but like they actually were, would keep that space so clean. But and I always remember sort of like being uncomfortable in the downstairs and then being like, once you got it, you're like, oh, and relax. Like I don't have to worry about like getting a fingerprint on something.
It's interesting, you know, as you're telling that story, when you said um, I went to some of those parties, you stopped and looked up to the right, which is that, you know, have you heard the thing? If people stop and look up to the left, they're lying. If they stop and look up to the right, they're telling the truth. It was
Yeah.
interesting seeing you access a memory.
Yeah.
And the thought I had that went through my head is he seeing the house? Is he seeing the party? Or is he remembering that a list of events happened? It's
I can answer the question.
Okay.
What I was recalling was it oh boy, it's almost visual. Like it was like I didn't see it, but like no, what I did was I opened up the folder. And there was some colors, and I remember like their Christmas tree, but I saw the Christmas tree a bunch of different times. And so then I was able to then remember like, oh, I was there at a party. There were a lot of people. I remember we were sneaking alcohol. Like, I mean, like there was a bunch of like, and then it was like, but it was weird. Like it's not visual, but like,
Yeah, because when
it's so
if I
strange.
stop and think Thanksgiving at grandma's, the first thing that happens for me is because they had an open floor plan, is the kitchen. I see the kitchen. I could draw it for you. Like I see the kitchen. I could even draw out what dishes are where. I can see the kitchen. I see the table. I see the living room. I hear the baseball game or the football game or the PBS or the golf or whatever it was they have going on in the background, or the Doctor Who. Although no, that was much later. All the books on the bookshelves. I could tell you what was on which shelf, you know, in their house. I could tell you which shelf had the entire list of National Geographic VHS tapes because she had the whole set for like 12 or 15 years. She got it every
And see,
month,
I can do that
but I
too.
can see it. I can see it like it's a photo,
And see the interesting thing is I can tell you all the same things. I can tell you the exact floor plan of my aunt's house. I can tell you about all the things that were in her living room. I can tell you about where, the hall closet where they had a Nintendo in an original, like packed in a box up in the shelf. They're like, oh yeah, we have it around if you want to play with it. It was like the thing that they would, like you would get at a board game. They would get out the Nintendo, but but I don't see any of it. It's all things I just like. Know.
Here's the best description I have for what's happening for me. If I opened up a first-person shooter like Half-Life,
okay,
when I'm seeing the memory, it's like I'm turning on the emulator. I'm stepping into the first-person emulator, and as I'm going through the memory, I'm moving around and seeing the stuff, and I can hit the 360 view and see the whole area. That's what's happening in my brain when I'm pulling this stuff up. That's exactly what it is, but it's much more HD. It almost looks like what they said you're going to be able to do with the Apple Vision Pro. Now, we really don't know. We just saw the one keynote, so we have no idea what that looks like yet. And I never got to play with Google Glasses or any of that kind of stuff. But it's
I want an Oculus so bad.
I haven't gotten to play with one of those yet either. But that's what's happening in my head.
Yeah.
And so it feels like some of the way you've described some of this stuff, you're almost there with some things. You just need a lot of repetitive. Like you have to have done it a lot for it to cross that threshold.
To get it closer to a visual memory, there has to be repeated. Like I could almost say there's almost a visual Apple, because it's something I've seen so many times that I have, the best way to describe it is I have a icon in my brain for what a visual apple looks like that I can reference, but I don't see it. It's just my brain has every single parameter already worked out that if I need to think about an apple, I would know, okay, I know it's got to have a little shine in the corner to show you that the light's reflecting off of it, but I can't see it. I just know exactly what it should look like.
It feels like you're describing your brain as running DOS, and I'm describing my brain as running a GUI interface like Windows or OS 9 or like a Mac OS. Because in DOS, like DOS could draw out, or in like a terminal thing, you could draw out what an apple looks like and have a reference apple, but it's not going to necessarily have the texture and the shape and all that kind of stuff. As I don't know, these are analogies. It's never going to be perfect.
It's like the. So here, let's try this. What I imagine that you're seeing, because I don't fully get it, is that you could Iron Man 2 style, where he throws the hologram up in front of him. Like I imagine that people can hologram up whatever they need to look at in front of themselves.
To a point, yes, to a point.
That's what my wife has described that she can do. She's hyperphantasia. So that's.
I think there's a couple of different levels. I think some people can throw up the fully interactive holographic interface, and I'm almost there. Then some people can throw up I'm going to go old school here, the Wolfenstein 3D first-person shooter, that old blocky, clunky one. So it's there, but it doesn't look right? But it's there. It's a poor visual image, but it's still interactive.
Yes.
Then there's people who throw up the poster on the wall, and so it's like a flat 2D style reference image, right? Yeah. Then there are those people who pull up the 3x5 photo, and it starts moving down there.
From what I understand, it's things get fuzzier and
Mhm.
less clear, and they also lose color.
Mm-hmm.
Most people don't have a lot of color in their memory. I think.
Oh,
that's
I
right.
do. But yeah.
But yeah, it's. So let's flip this. We've been talking a lot about visual memory. So now here's a question I want to ask you. How do you recall things that you have like read in a book?
You blurred out. I didn't hear anything. I heard, how do you,
It's all good.
and you
It's all
stop.
good. How do you recall
And you're
things
blurred out
that
still.
you've Oh, damn. You good? Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you. Yeah.
All right, let's give it a second and make sure it stays solid.
This buffer. I don't know what's going on with the internet
I don't
today.
know. Okay. How do you recall things that you've God damn.
Did it again. Okay, you're fuzzy, but I see you. Try and talk.
How do you recall things that you've read in a book?
I hear the story in my head. I hear the story in the internal voice that I read to myself in, which is not the voice that I have when I hear myself recorded or that I have here. I have a slightly different. I have no idea where this voice comes from. I have no reference for it. But when I read, I hear the story. I do not see the words. So, for example, Rambo 3, which was a wonderful novel and a horrible movie. There's a scene that's not in the movie, that's in the book. And I'm hearing it, and now as I'm describing it, it's shifting from hearing to visualization. I'm visualizing it because when I read, I see what I'm reading in my head like it's a movie or a cartoon. There's a scene where they're trying to make it from Pakistan to Afghanistan, and there's a sandstorm blowing in, and they're worried about getting caught in the sandstorm, and so they bury themselves under blankets and their horses and camels and stuff under the blankets, and they end up getting buried, and they have to dig their way out of it. Well, when I went to go reference it, I heard it, and then I saw it, as I told you. So if I'm thinking about it, I hear it, and then if I think about it more, I see it moves from audio to visual, and then, if I'm telling somebody, it's very visual.
So you are essentially recalling the visual memory that you made the first time you read it.
The auditory memory first. It always starts as a monologue. Like someone is like an audiobook. It starts like an audiobook, and then it kicks into visual.
Is the visual memory is the imaging that you're seeing now the same thing that you saw when you read it the first time, or do you think it's?
I honestly, that I couldn't tell you.
That's the answer to the question then. So
yeah,
yes,
it could. It's probably not. It's probably not. Okay. But it's different. Hold on 1 second.
So then you're having an auditory memory.
I'm having an auditory memory because I associate reading with the voice I read in my head. And then from that, I extrapolate a visual image that I am building as I read it.
My friend was telling me about this because I've got all my buddies thinking about perception as well because I won't shut up about it. But he was telling me that we were talking about books and reading, and he was saying that the thing that he has, yes, the problem he has with audiobooks or something, but he was saying that he has to read it along with it in his head, essentially. And that if something else is going on, it doesn't process. So it sounds like it's the same thing that you're talking about, but he's having to repeat it back, and yours is just.
But I'm not having to repeat it back. This is only when I'm recalling something I've already read. And I have an image in my brain that is its own thing, like the Dresden Files, Murphy. I have an image of what Murphy looks like, and it's not like the image that's exactly described in the book. And I think that's because I saw the show the one-season show before I read the book. So I morphed the actress who played Murphy, who was a brunette and too tall, into a smaller kind of dirty blonde version of Murphy. And then she ended up with the like boobs, legs, and butt of one of my friends who was a cheerleader in high school, kind of as the shape, because he describes her as like a cheerleader's build. Like he's like, she's a short little 5-foot cheerleader. And so it's morphed into this person that I've never actually seen. And it's bits of other people, right? That I have built into this like this character.
About Dresden then?
And Dresden is what's the name of the actor who played him in the TV show?
Blackstone.
He was in Arrow. He played the police chief in Arrow.
Blackstone.
Yeah, Blackstone. It's him taller and lankier and a little more grizzled.
And see, like,
and it's also a cross between James Marsters' face, is like a grizzled Spike, and him. It's almost like a really grizzled, dark-haired Marsters. Anyway, but I've taken these things and they've all kind of fit together. But Harry's also easier because Harry's on the book covers, so I had a visual reference for him to look at.
I'll give you an example of this for me. So, and we'll go with Harry Potter because this is the one I can remember. So when I read the first 3 Harry Potter books in one run, because that's how far it was when I got into them. So well before the movies came out, and so literally all I had was the picture of the boy on the cover, and that was the only. And then everything else I just sort of had to. Like, I didn't really have an image for those people. I just sort of, again, it described them. I understood what they looked like, but I didn't have any sort of representation for them. And then what was interesting now is that as I read them back to my kids, as I'm reading them, I'm recalling the movies. And that's again, I don't see it, but when I'm reading about the person, I know it's Emma Watson or whatever.
For me, Carlos is a slightly shorter Eddie Guerrero, right? So because it's this like swarthy, dark. It's Eddie Guerrero with darker skin, because he's like this swarthy Spanish-speaking guy, and so I just took someone who's kind of like that and morphed him to fit, right? And Butters, is just this kind of like generic nerd figure in my head. Michael, and this doesn't so I have a vision of what Michael looks like in my head, and the closest I could describe it would be like if you gave Drew McIntyre a military style buzz cut and made him like shot full of like gray hair, like salt and pepper hair. So if you pull up a picture of Drew McIntyre with that dark strong jaw beard, and because he carries a freaking claymore, so and he's a big guy, and he's about the right size, but that kind of like big muscled, it is very similar to him. But I had that image in my head before I ever saw Drew McIntyre, and I went, oh, that kind of looks like Michael. It wasn't. I used Drew McIntyre as it's like, oh, that kind of looks like the Michael character. If I had to cast Michael, that's who I'd cast.
So let me tell you what just happened there. You said Drew McIntyre.
Uh-huh.
I knew who you were talking about.
Yes.
And I went, do I know what he looks like? And I said, yes, I know what Drew McIntyre looks like. And then you said, look it up. And I went, okay, I'm going to look it up. And I looked it up and I went, yes, that's correct. That's what he looks like. How is that possible?
And see, here's how it starts with me. As my brain begins to form Drew McIntyre, the image is in my brain, and then his name comes out. And I do this a lot of times. It's because I'm horrible with names, especially with people I work with. I will see their face, and I can describe stuff about them, and I can't tell you what their name is.
Oh, I'm really bad
coworkers.
with names.
Yeah, but I see them. It's like I'm looking at a photo. It's like I'm looking at the directory photo.
And see, so again, that's sort of almost exactly the same thing as me. I'm just bad at names. So I will see someone and I know that I know who they are, and I know who they are and what they've done and all that, but I don't know what their name is. Like there's a manila folder in my brain full of all the information that I do know about this person, and where there's supposed to be a name, there's just a big fucking question mark, and I don't know what's.
See, I do something kind of different, and I'm going to use it like my friend that we both know at work, Ashley. Like the image that pops in my head of Ashley, because it happens so many times, is her kind of leaning over talking to me because I sat across from her so often. So it's that image, that whole image, whenever I think about her, and then I can fill it in for whatever else is going on. Anybody else that I work with all the time. My friend that I used to work with, Tara, who hopefully will be a guest down the line. My image of her is very specific, and it ties back to a deeply profound conversation we had, and I don't even know if she realizes how profound it was for me at the time. But when I pull her up, it's her sitting in the chair, kind of, because we were sitting like next to each other, kind of looking at me like this. And that's the image of Tara I have every time, because there's an emotion and an event and a thing tied to her. So that's the first thing that pops up specifically. And to some people, it's just a generic image. But when it's a person who I've had a significant contact with, it's like I pick a reference point. My friend Tracy. There's a couple of them. There's 2 or 3 that'll pop up. My buddy Brian that you know. That one's easy. Brian pops up, and it's him wearing his fedora hat and a towel at a frat party going, "I'm naked guy," and that's it.
Right.
That's Brian in my brain forever. And the visual comes up as the name comes up, or before. It's happening so fast. And the better I know the person, the better I know the material, the faster the image comes up and the crisper it is.
Right.
The less referenced it is, or the more I have to think about, like I think back to, Jeff Brown, who is someone I knew in elementary and junior high and played soccer with. It took a minute. It's like, and then he's there. But it's not Jeff how I know he looks now. It's Jeff how he looked when we were playing soccer together.
Yeah.
But I know what Jeff looks like. But it's hard for me to pull up the image because I'm pulling up a different image.
Yeah, it's
kind of like your reference apple. Some people I have a reference thing of them.
Well, I mean, and that's just a thing that our perception is. Our brain makes icons out of everything, because that's the only way we don't get overloaded by information, is that where your brain has to just be like, there's a whole bunch of stuff over there, all my comic books and stuff, and so my brain just sort of like, that doesn't change, and so it doesn't really register or pay attention to any of that until I need to. And that's sort of, I think, where you run into that thing where I'm looking for my keys, and my keys aren't on the kitchen table. I know they're not on the kitchen table. That's not where they are. And so I'll walk into the room and look at the kitchen table, and guess what? They're on the table, but I don't see them. They are not there. Your brain has already decided that they're not there.
My oldest did that the other day, and he was freaking out because he was going to be late to work. And he's like, "I can't find my keys. I can't find my keys." And I walk in, and this is going to add a whole nother layer to it. And the keys had landed on kind of a dark orange pair of shorts, and he's colorblind. And I think he physically didn't see the keys. Now, granted, those aren't the colors he's colorblind to, but it just grayed out. Like it just blended in, and he didn't see them. The other thing, you're talking about referencing like visual stuff. Like I looked over and I'm like, I know I have Space Marines on the shelf. I can even tell you a lot of the ones that are there. But I couldn't tell you which shelf they're on and in the order. And then when I go and look at them, oh, of course it's there. That's where it is. But it is just too much information, right? Too many things. There's 300 or 400 figures over there. It's like, I think the white ones are on top and the green ones are here, and I think the tanks are on that one. But I couldn't tell you, even though I took the time to almost put them out like a diorama style. And I put a lot of thought into who do I want where. I couldn't tell you what it looks like, other than it's just this generic image of a Space Marine army.
Well, and I think this is something that I've been trying to communicate better about as I'm starting to recognize these things. Is there's things that I just don't save.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
If you think about everything's a text message that's coming through you to information. Like some things you go like, oh, that's important. I'm going to put that in a folder and remember that I was told that. And some things you just don't save. I don't remember what my wife asked me something tonight, do you remember what the this or that or the other was? And my response was like, oh, I didn't save that. Like that I know I knew that at one point, but I did not save that information. I didn't think you were going to ask me again,
Yeah.
And I think that's a lot of things that we do. Like, I think that's why we lose things is because we just set it down and we don't save it. And something
it doesn't move from short term to midterm to long term, right? And I think a lot of times, especially with like keys, we usually put them someplace. And so we may set them down somewhere else in the house. But our brain has filed, we put the keys down. That means they're on the kitchen table, the nightstand, the wherever. And then they're not there. And you're like, oh, crap. Where?
And so something that I started doing, because the question I always hated is, well, where was the last place you saw them? Well, I don't remember.
That we wouldn't have this issue.
That is something that just now I realized that's why I hate that question, because I used to get asked that question as a kid all the time. Well, where was the last time you saw him? Well, who knows that question? Why would you even ask that question?
My parents would ask it, and they used to ask that one, and then they'd start asking it. I don't remember who did it, but somebody started asking it a different way, and it helped better. Was retrace your steps.
Yes.
And then it's going backwards and going, okay, and that it didn't always fix it. Like eventually we would find
that's how I find things
retracing
too.
My steps. Yeah. But now we have tile or air tags, so, but again, I think a lot of this is also information overload. Processing massive amounts of data,
right,
and significantly more executive decisions than we're designed to make at a biological level.
Well, I mean,
let me finish. What I mean by that is thinking back to my sociology studies. It is like old time in the college. Hunter-gatherer style tribes don't work that long each day. Right? They have a certain number of tasks they need to do to feed themselves and get the calorie intake they need and be cool. And they have a lot more downtime than we do.
4 to 5 hours.
It's like 4 to 5 hours a day on average.
Yeah.
And that's what we're built for.
Yeah.
Is 4 to 5 hours of simple work with simple tools, with just what's happening around us coming in as sensory information. And that is not how we live.
No.
And so I think a lot of the stuff we're dealing with in general, be it anxiety, maybe the rise in autism, for all I know, because of the way the neuroatypical brain, right? Although I think that may have been around a lot longer than we realized it was, to be perfectly honest. The stresses, the diseases, the mental health problems, and all this is just every year. There's exponentially more sensory input and data, and we're not hardwired for it. We're not.
I wonder. I'm just going to say this: if the rise in resolution on TV screens has had anything to do with that. Because it's not real 3D imagery. It's all a trick. It's tricking your brain into thinking it's something else. And as it's gotten more complicated, it's requiring more processing power to process it because the pixels, I don't know.
I also wonder if the shift from a tube style television to the modern flat screens have had an impact, because there's a very different way the light moves through it and handles all that and does all that. All of this, I think, contributes to what's going on. But one of the reasons I'm talking about all this is there have been some studies done with people who have had serious sleep issues. And they have taken some of those people and effectively taking them out camping for 2 weeks. Not hard camping, like you got a tent, you got a sleeping bag, you got your food, you got a propane stove, right? But you're out and
cabin
unplugged.
camping.
What you're unplugged. You're unplugged. And the ones I've seen have had to do with the tent because they wanted more of the sensory input from what was going on, right? But usually within between 3 to 7 days, their circadian rhythms were fixed. And they were back to where they were supposed to be. And their blood pressure was lower. And their stress was, even if they're not outdoorsy people, this was something that's been seen. And it makes me think back to, there's a tradition in so many cultures of when someone needs to make some kind of important decision, they go away for a bit.
They go off into the wilderness.
Or just into seclusion, right? I'm going to adjourn and make a decision.
Jesus goes off to the garden to go think about it before everything's going to go down.
And I was more thinking the pause to reflect.
Yes,
the pause to reflect, and we don't do that. We don't do that anymore.
No, things move too quick. We don't have time.
We don't have time, and that's fair. But I think with the amount of sensory input we have now, and I know we've gotten way off topic with this, but
I wasn't saying that was a good thing, by the way. Things move too fast was a criticism.
Yeah. I think the closest thing in pre-electrical industrial human civilization was war, combat, where you're having to make instantaneous life or death decisions, be it small or large scale, right? This hyper thing. And your senses get all pulled up and all of that. And I'm wondering if our brains are reacting to the sheer amount of stimulus the same way we do when we're in a dangerous situation. Take driving, for example. Driving is an inherently unnatural act. And I think Rogan talked about this the other day on one of the shows I saw, where he was talking about when you're driving, you're in fight or flight mode.
Yeah.
You're right there, which might be why we get so many road rages going on. Like normally if someone, it had to be Rogan because he said something like, if somebody steps in front of you while you're walking, you don't go off on them. But if somebody cuts you off while you're driving, you're doing 75, 85 miles an hour. It's life or death. You got to make a decision type thing, and you're just wired up, and that's got to release. And we've just got so much coming at us all the time.
And then that person. So and then take that. You get cut off, and there's an anger there. That's just going to happen.
Yes.
Period. But then add on top of that they're late to work.
Mm-hmm.
That doesn't pay them enough money, and they're stressed about bills, and their wife is on the phone with them right now, nagging at them about something, and that person cuts them off, and then it's just it's the end of the world, and everybody's stressed out.
It's funny you say the end of the world, and we saw that the last couple of days. There's been some videos of climate protesters going around, and we're not going to get into the climate thing right now, but these climate protesters shut down the roads, and the people were losing it. And the climate protesters didn't seem to understand they weren't getting their message across. because these people were like, look, I think there was one woman who said something like, I understand the world is melting, but I've got to get to work. I've got to feed my kids. Get out of my way. Yeah. And I think we were this close. Somebody killing somebody over it. Yeah, and I think it was, I saw a video that somebody in Germany where they tried to do this, ran into somebody with a car. So
you're pushing them down the road. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and let's tie this in. Let's talk about, from the standpoint of the protesters, their perception, what they've been taught and what their perception is that the world is coming to an end.
Yeah, we'll all be dead in 20 years.
If we don't fix this, we're going to be dead in 20 years. Now, I remember 20 years ago when Al Gore told us all we were going to be dead in 20 years, and we're not. So, yeah, putting that aside,
and
they have been convinced in the cult of climate change. Again, we're not discussing.
We're not talking about climate change. Yeah, we're not getting into climate change. We do agree there is a cult of climate change.
These people are because at one of those events they crashed some hoity-toity party. Rock on. Annoy the heck out of those guys. I don't care. But one of the girls was screaming like, "We're gonna die," and I was like, that's the emotion. They are at the cutoff of the car of, oh my God, I'm going to die if I don't resolve this problem right now. Like, and we've keyed them up to the point where they think the world's going to die tomorrow.
And the older boomer generation, the Gen Xers, and the Zennials, which is what you like to call yourself, are like, yeah, maybe not, because they've cried wolf one too many times. Because you remember the Gore thing. I remember the Carter-Reagan debate about the coming ice age. Yeah, that, before the year 2000, New York would be unlivable because it'd be under a glacier again, right? And again, we're not getting into the science of this and is it happening? Climate change happens. That is a definitive fact.
Yeah.
Climate change happens on this planet. Period. End of story. And if you don't think so, one of these days the sun is going to freaking blow up and burn us to a crisp. Climate change happens, right? And we haven't even dealt with the worst type of climate change. If we get hit with another one of those events that hit us in the 1880s, 1890s, where the solar flare hit and powered all the telegraph lines without being connected to power, we're back in the dark ages again.
But, all right, well, hang on. You said that. No, I got a tangent for 2 seconds on that. If we're gonna throw that out there, we're gonna have to chop this thing up. It's gonna be fun. All right, so we're talking. There was a solar flare in 18. I forget when it was, but it melted equipment. It blew lines up. It started a couple of fires. It wasn't terrible, but there also wasn't a lot of stuff.
The Carrington event.
Yes. When?
Carrington event, 1859.
Okay, 1859. There is not a lot of electronics in 1859.
Telegraph. That was it.
That's it. Yeah, there wasn't a ton of stuff. And so, again, it caused a couple of fires. It was definitely destructive. Mm-hmm. An invisible thing from the sun smashed into the planet and all the shit blew up. Could you imagine if something happened like that today? And at the point as our poles are shifting and our and our magnetic protection is starting to waver, if we got hit, I mean, you can't argue with the poles are shifting. They are.
It happens. It happens.
Whether or not we're going to have a pole shift and the crazy Earth is going to, who knows what's going to happen with that? But
we know it happens. We know it happens.
They're moving.
No, I mean, we know that they've flipped in the past. That is a fact that we have measured.
We don't know what happened when it flipped.
No, we don't. But we know that they have flipped multiple times.
Yeah, there are many speculations. I love the crazy one of the poles are going to flip and then the rotation shifts.
Yeah. So who knows what happens? Who knows what happens?
But the poles are moving. The magnetic fields are diminishing.
Mm-hmm.
If we had a similar flare like 1850, I mean, so I would assume it's only going to damage the side of the planet it hits. I mean, but more than the other, I would think.
We don't know. I mean, we don't have enough measurable data
Right.
from
I mean,
back then.
I'm just sort of
Yeah.
making a weird speculation on this, but like, I mean, even if it was only one, just everything.
So all this stuff
all the
happens.
Phones, all the cars, all the everything.
Yeah, everything just stopped.
Everything.
You know what? You want a good idea of what this looks like? Go find the book Lights Out and read it.
Yes.
It's an exceptional book. You can find it free on the internet. The guy released it free. It was Lights Out by, I can't remember the author's name right now. There's a couple of them, but and that one was fascinating because that was one of the first books I ever read that took place where I knew where the stuff was.
Yeah.
So I visualized that one in like 4K because it takes place in and around San Antonio and Central Texas.
This one was one of, being from Texas and knowing like the freeways and stuff.
Yeah. So how did you see that book?
It's called Lights Out by David Crawford. It's on Amazon if you want to find it.
Yeah, and if you can find the original one he released online, it has more stuff in it. The one that's on Amazon has been edited down a little bit. Not enough that it's a significantly different book, but
that book was just I could put
so
things
when you
on
read
a
that
map.
book, how did you see it? So it was like you had a roadmap out, or because it talks about going through like Hutto. I mean,
yeah,
you live in Hutto.
I remember. Boy, I'm trying to remember what that was. It doesn't really change anything for me. Like it is significantly. Like I know where things are taking place. It just gives me more reference material essentially in my brain. You know, as it's filling. I mean, I've driven enough around Texas that I know what it looks like. In Texas looks like. You know
I'm thinking specifically back to there's a section where some people go from like north of Austin, like up near Dallas, and they make a trek which takes them like 6 months because of all the stuff that's going on down to San Antonio. And the route they go is a route I've driven so many times. It's like he mentions a railroad. I'm like, I know right where that railroad crossing is. I you know, it's the railroad crossing right up from where you live, right? Mm-hmm. And they talk about like Seguin and Luling, and I'm like, I know those places. I know what the mesquite brush looks like. I know when he says, "Oh, you know," I could almost visualize which ranch it was they stopped to like find water at a big, stock tank.
And see, all that happens for me, because again, I don't see it, but it's just. I just have reference material. The example would be if you were. Here's a good example. Many years ago, there was a hurricane in Houston, and my parents had to get out of town. My mom went up to Dallas because she was doing something up there. My dad came and crashed with me for a few days, and he was like, "While I'm here, I want to watch all of the Lord of the Rings, and I want you to tell me what the hell is going on because I can't keep it all straight."
Fair enough.
So we sat there. He had the remote, and every 5 minutes he'd pause it and go, "Who the hell is this again? And why do I care?" And and so I can watch a movie and what or any sort of thing like, and it's just I have more information about the character. I have a heads up menu in my brain that opens a file, and I just know all these facts about this particular person. And the more things I know that are specific, the more information I have. So like, I know where that place is. I just have more data that's accurate. Because that's why I have such a trouble with fantasy books, is because I don't have the and there's no file. I haven't built a file structure of visual imagery because it's hard for me to populate that world. So there was a book I read as a kid by Piers Anthony called Kilobyte, I don't know how I picked it up. I got it at a library one time, but it was about these two people who fell in love in a virtual reality game, and it was a fantasy world, but because it wasn't actually fantasy and it was a video game, I had enough reference material of what a castle in a video game looks like that it made it compelling enough for me to
you could see, oh, that's the castle from Castlevania, because that's a video game castle, right?
Right.
And you and I have talked about this. There is a list of movies that you and I need to like binge one weekend to build your fantasy reference. And this comes back to your parents didn't let you watch enough TV in Houston in the 80s. No, I'm being very serious.
Right.
Because some of my clearest, earliest movie memories, other than Star Wars and like Star Trek and that kind of stuff, was, Excalibur.
Which I've seen.
The Beastmaster.
Which I haven't.
Conan the Barbarian. Conan the Destroyer. The Sword and the Sorcerer. Lady Hawk.
I love Lady Hawk.
And a dozen other really bad bees, sword and sorcery type movies. That Jason and the Argonauts. A lot of this is the old claymation stuff that I grew up on.
Yeah.
So here, Clash of the Titans. I had to deprogram myself because I watched Clash of the Titans so many times because they took like 8 Greek myths and smashed them together. And then I was like, that's not really the real story. The Kraken's a Norse thing. What is going, But I had all of this. And then I also watched Godzilla movies all the time. And, sci-fi, monster, sword, sorcery.
So
I had that frame of reference before I ever started reading them.
So I went back and watched Excalibur, Conan, and Lady Hawk because I wanted the reference material. Those movies were referenced a whole bunch in the book Ready Player One, which I really enjoyed, and I really enjoy Ready Player One because I know all the references. They make one line reference to Ghostbusters, and I have a huge Ghostbusters folder that I have all this information that helps me understand all the references he's trying to reference. They go down to the next one, and it's it's The Last Starfighter. I have a whole folder of The Last Starfighter, and they make a line reference like, oh, I get that reference. I know, so that book, but there were references I didn't get. And so then I went to go watch that movie so that I could fill in the reference points.
You just reminded me of Captain America and the Avengers going, I get that reference.
Yes, very much.
Yeah. But I think you would enjoy a lot of these films.
Oh, I'm sure.
Now, they're not modern art pieces by any stretch of the imagination.
Yes.
There is some cheese factor. But if you go into an understanding that it's all filmed with physical stuff, there was no CGI.
Yeah.
And so it was done very differently. You realize and appreciate the art for it. There is a soundtrack that I'm listening to, and I mentioned this to you the other day, which is interesting. I have just, in the last couple of months, been able to start listening to music regularly again. I went almost 5 years without listening to any music at all. A little bit, but almost none, for a variety of reasons that all had to do with my divorce and all that stuff. But so D&D released Spelljammer last year, and I bought the musical compendium they had commissioned to go with Spelljammer, and it is very much done in the style of like Flash Gordon. It's this weird, trippy, everything's different. And there's super deep cut. Like I haven't listened to all of it. And I ordered like the vinyl set that came with it. And so I've got the vinyls and then anyway, and there's one called like the Lost Nautiloid or something like that. And I was listening to the song today and they were singing about the birth cycle of the Mind Flayers. That if you haven't read the 3rd edition book they released about like how the Mind Flayers reproduce, you would, the cuts were so deep in it. It was like, this is epic nerd level stuff. And then they made a song out of it. But it's just this weird, trippy kind of space opera, crazy, embrace the bearded guy with the eagle wings flying in, with the flash stuff, and
The Eagle Wings guy that's Barbarella. The dude with the big wings.
I gotta figure out what's going on with the buffering. Ask the question again. I missed it.
I was saying, isn't that Barbarella? The dude with the wings?
That's also a guy with eagle's wings. So pull up Flash Gordon real quick. Flash Gordon Eagle Wings, or Flash Gordon Flying People, and you'll see it's a famous actor who does it.
Yeah.
Because at the end, the Hawkmen or whatever they are called come in.
Yes, Ajax.
Yeah.
Hawkman versus Ajax. Yeah, I forgot about that. Yeah, I haven't seen that movie in.
I love that
my
movie.
dad liked that one. I haven't seen. I haven't seen it in a long time.
And a lot of the sword and sorcery movies from the 80s are like that because they had limited budgets, practical effects.
I think my dad I think what it was, honestly, is my parents weren't into fantasy. They were into sci-fi.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was like Buckaroo Banzai was what that was the stuff we were watching. I don't know if you've ever seen Buckaroo Banzai.
Oh yeah, I love that movie. It's got everybody in it. Everybody's a massive star.
Everybody.
Yeah.
But then we were watching Doctor Who and we were watching Star Trek and Star Wars. I mean, my parents were into sci-fi, which is why I'm into sci-fi. But we just didn't have fantasy in the house.
And you know what's funny about that is neither of my parents like sci-fi or fantasy. My mom likes soap operas and procedurals like Chicago Hope, ER, NYPD Blue, that kind of stuff. That's what she likes. Or All My Children. Those are the stories she likes. Those long episodic stories. My dad likes war movies and westerns. And so I grew up on that. But because my parents didn't give a damn if I had the TV on, and it was always on, especially and you have to understand most of this, and for those people who didn't grow up in Houston, pre-cable, pre-internet, pre-streaming, back we had like 8 channels. There was Channel 20 in Houston, and Channel 20 eventually became UPN, and it was all syndicated stuff. It was a syndicated local channel. And they did Saturday afternoon movies. And in the summer, it was so hot from like 1 to 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and it would rain almost every day in the summer, that we'd go outside and we'd play, and then it'd get hot, we'd come in for lunch, and then my brother and I would go and turn the TV on in the we called it the playroom, but we had converted the garage into a big room, and that's where mom ran her babysitting business out of, and it had a TV in it, and we turned on the TV and sit on the couch, and we'd watch whatever we wanted to watch, and it was whatever was on. It was the Saturday afternoon matinee, and they do a double, they do a back to back, and it would be like 2 Godzillas, or a sword and a sorcery, or this, or 2 sci-fi things, or whatever. I was the MST3K kid on the couch watching those old movies, which is why I like Mystery Science Theater 3000 so much, because that's me. That's me and my brother. And my brother and I have wildly different we like a lot of the same stuff, but to different degrees. And my parents realized what I liked and had me watch what they watched, but then encouraged me to watch what I liked too.
Yeah.
And my dad was a voracious reader, and my mom wasn't. My mom still, it's torture to get her to read a magazine because she's just not a very good reader. I think she may have some dyslexia in there too, and never dealt with it. I think that's my theory. But my dad was like me. He'd get a paperback, and it's done by the end of the night, like a 200 or 300 page paperback. That's like 3 hours of reading, 4 hours of reading, and we're done. We're just going to blow through these. And he would have me read what he'd read, but my treat as a child was we would go to the used bookstore, and he'd give me $10. And back then, in the mid 80s,
You get
$10.
books like $1.
Yeah, 50 cents sometimes.
Yeah,
I'd walk
sometimes.
out. I'd walk out with a stack of books almost that I couldn't carry. That they were so
Yeah.
tall. But I would go and buy entire like series, and I'd get hooked. We stop at a garage sale, and I can tell you the day I became a fantasy fan, like going from casual to like hardcore.
Hmm.
I was 9. We stopped at a garage sale, and somebody had the original Dragonlance trilogy for 25 cents a piece, and I
Yeah.
had 75 cents on me, and I bought them, and I read them, and they were amazing and in depth, and the characters had so much growth, and it was just like nothing else I'd ever seen or done. I mean, to me, that was Lord of the Rings, because
Yeah.
I love Lord of the Rings. I love the story, but it is not the easiest books to read. They are not the easiest books to read. Dragonlance was like cotton candy. Lord of the Rings, like, just feed it to me, feed it. It's also the first
Yeah.
time I can remember reading a book and breaking down into tears when one of the main characters died, thinking this is the worst thing that happened. And then I get to book 3, and another one died. And the first one at least died in battle. And
Yeah.
spoilers, the second one, they're like headed to the thing, and he's an old guy all the way through it, and he falls over dead of a heart attack. And I'm just like, oh my God. They were running towards something. They hadn't even gotten into a fight. Died of a heart attack. And they described it. They're like, he got this burst of energy. He felt like he was real young. Then his left arm started to hurt, and it all twisted up, and he's like, fell back, and he's having trouble breathing, and he's like, oh no, and then there's a healer there trying to heal him. And he's like, no, it's my time. And I'm just like, at like 8 or 9 years old, going like, what the hell is happening here? It's
Yeah.
just,
See,
because he was the
I,
grandfather character, and it was just so, yeah.
what we did was the library a lot.
We
So
never did the library because there wasn't one close.
There was a library that was literally like at the end of the block from the school that I went to. There was a library that was walking distance from our house. I mean, it was 6-7 blocks. So I used to ride my bike to the
Yeah,
library.
but you were in
and then
town.
And then my parents, my dad, would take me to the downtown Houston library once a month. And we'd go spend 2 or 3. They would just let me just go. I would run all over the library.
The library.
So
the libraries I had access to were the school libraries. And in elementary school,
some good school libraries.
In elementary school, they were age appropriate books. But by the time I was in second or third grade, I was already reading novelizations of movies I'd seen. So I'm walking around with Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan, and everybody else is like, "Where's the Dr. Seuss book?" Right?
Right.
Because I started reading so early.
I did the same thing.
But it wasn't until junior high where I started getting a decent school library, and that's where I found the Greek myths. And I remember there was a whole wall of them, and I read every one of them. And then I got to the high school library, and it had like novels, like modern fiction, like stuff that had come out within the last 5 or 10 years, like Stephen King stuff. And they have books that I don't think should be in the library. And I'm not a massive book banner, but if anybody's read it, there's freaking child porn in that book.
Yeah,
like straight up. Weird. It's disturbing and twisted. I read it as like a 14-year-old and didn't think anything of it. But now thinking back on it, I'm like, got a bunch of like 13-year-olds screwing in the sewers, and he's describing it in fairly graphic detail. I mean, not in like an erotica level detail, but enough, right? And I saw somewhere somebody said the way to explain Gen X is they all read a Stephen King book too early.
Never read Stephen King.
I've only read a few of it. I read that. I read The Stand, which took forever to get through. It was great, but took forever to get through.
No, I take that back. I have read Stephen King. I read the one about the time traveler in JFK was really good.
I haven't read that one. And see, most of my exposure to Stephen King is,
11/22/68.
I think it was NBC, it was ABC, NBC, or CBS. One of them would do the made-for-TV movies, like the Saturday night movie.
Mhm.
And for like 5 or 8 years, like every 3 months, it was a Stephen King movie. Like it was The Langoliers, and then it was this, and it was that, and it was. I mean, the first time I saw it was the made-for-TV 2-part special with Tim Curry, right? And it was
Yeah.
terrifying. That's how I was exposed. That's how I saw this thing. And those books were too advanced for me. So I would watch the movie and then I could get through the book. Because I remember there was another one that was like that. I got Dune, and Dune is not an easy read. It doesn't look like a hard read, but it's dense. And I watched that 80s Dune movie and I went, I now have enough frame of reference I can read the book.
Yeah.
Because they're not the same, but it gave me enough to fill in it was almost like what you're saying with fantasy. I needed enough visual reference because that was more than I could conceive at the time. The sci-fi was so far out there that it was like, this isn't like Star Wars or Star Trek. This is so much further out there.
Which is why a lot of the books, like one of my most favorite books as a kid was Ender's Game. But I was also
but I didn't read that till high school.
Sci-fi, and so
I read that for a book report in my junior year.
I had the wonderful school librarian at the private school that I went to, who they knew my mom, and that she came up to me when I was probably in, I don't know, 6th, 7th grade, and was like, "You need to read this." And I was like, "Really?" And she's like, "Yeah, your mom knows. You're fine." Okie dokie. And I just took, but she just like knew that it was like, "Oh yeah, no, this is one that you need to read." And that book was good. Hooked me.
And see, that may have been about the same time I read it, because
possibly
it had just recently come out. It hadn't been out that long.
When did that come out?
And that's that 5-year age gap, man. That's where that's catching us is.
Ender's Game would have been. Oh no, Ender's Game came out in 85.
Okay, well, I was exposed to it about the same time you were.
Yeah,
but I was in high school.
Yeah,
and because I was reading fantasy, I was buying Dragonlance, and I was buying Forgotten Realms, and that was like 85% of my book consumption. Because for those people who don't know it, they put out so many of those books in the 80s and the 90s. I mean, they were there were like 2 a month coming out. TSR was cranking them out. Yeah.
I because we went to the library, I found radio shows and audiobooks, which is where I spent years working. I mean, they had 2 of those big, like, pull open drawer, like manila sort of
I know what you're talking about.
You know what I'm talking about? And I think each cabinet had 3 rows of cassette tapes in them. And it was all old time radio stuff. So it would just be like, Jack Benny shows. And then it was like 50 episodes, on all these. And I just worked because you could only take 5 out at a time, or 10 or something like that. I went enough times that at some point I went to them and was like, "I've been checking out 5 a time for like a year. Can y'all like let me take more? Like, have I not earned my trust yet?" And they let me take more. But I was just burning through those things.
And see, I got burned by an audiobook because I spent we were going to go on this big road trip. I spent the money, like the $40 to get the audiobook, because I was so excited. I was like, "Oh, they did the audiobook. They did the trilogy of the Dragonlance trilogy." And I got the first book, and it was like 4 cassette tapes. And then when I was done, I was like, this was like 3 hours. They skipped 85% of the book.
Yeah.
And that's when I went, that's when I learned what abridged meant. And I went,
yeah.
And then I remember when Apple started selling, because I bought my initial books from the iTunes store. When Apple very first started doing it, you had to look, is this abridged or unabridged? Like the first couple of years. And now I think they're all unabridged.
Yeah, I don't
much.
think they really abridge books anymore. And I almost think the abridging was done because of the limitation of the cassette. That they didn't want to sell a book that was 25 cassettes. Now, I remember my parents had the Bible on cassette, and that thing was 50 cassettes or whatever.
And it wasn't just cassette. CD was just as bad, because I have the 6th Harry Potter book somewhere around here on
it's
CD.
Like 12 DVDs,
and it's like 12 or 15 CDs. And I remember my in-laws somebody had burned them the entire Harry Potter collection, and it was like 150 or 200 CD stack of all of them. Like you remember you buying the CDs in the big spindle? Right. It was that. So I don't think unabridged really came into its own until we had digital downloads.
Right.
So I think it was a limit. You're right. It was a limitation of the media.
That it became very clear that people were like, no, we want the whole book. Now, I do think the thing that that Blinkist is doing is kind of interesting, where you can go and listen to a 15-minute sort of distillation of a book, which I like to do to be able to go like, nah, I don't need to read that one. Or you go through it and you're like, actually, I think I am going to read that one. That being said, people do try to act like they've read a book when they haven't by saying,
use the way you just described it. Use the way you just described it as, do I want to read this or not? Yes. However, I have run into people in my professional life that have told me that a book is not worth reading, or that I didn't understand what the book meant. And I'm like, well, when so you've read it? And they're like, no, I listened to the 15-minute thing on Blinkist. And I'm like, specifically about the 12 rules for life. They're like, oh, no, I know the Peterson book. I listened to it on Blinkist. It's this, that. I'm like, you don't know what the hell you're talking about.
Yeah,
there's so much more in that book. And unfortunately, this was someone who was above me in the hierarchy. And so I really couldn't tell them what I thought of what they were doing.
Right.
And, but as a filter, that's awesome. But not as a like, I'm going to know what's really going on here. That's like, reading the Cliff Notes and then saying you've really done a good, literary analysis of a novel, right?
Right.
It's like, no, you haven't. And I didn't realize how important that was until I got into grad school and I started doing like the biblical analysis and stuff, and realizing how much you had to dig into like just like chapters of things and how much. Anyway, we've gotten way off topic.
We're gonna go ahead and stop it here.
We're gonna wrap up. But all this ties into it's not all aphantasia, but it's all perception. It's all how are we pulling the stuff in, and that's what it feels like the aphantasia has grown into for us. That's kind of where we're headed with this, right?
I think so.
It's like I can't stop thinking about like how I'm taking information in around me, which is wonderful. I think it has helped a lot.
And then comparing that to the way that other people take in information as well, and then how does my understanding of the way you understand something help me to better, and then that's the thing that I think the big takeaway from this has been is that now the conversations that you and I are having, and my wife and I are having, and my friends and I are having is like, well, how are you processing this information? Are you doing it this way? Well, I do it this way. Okay, maybe I need to explain things to you differently when I talk to you.
Yeah.
And that's the big thing that my wife and I have is like, she now understands I need to keep explaining something to him until he goes, got it. And then I know he understands what I'm, but like that was something that we had to figure out. And you work these things out in relationships anyway, but having a framework of like, you now understand how my perception works really changes the way that you communicate.
And it's really helped in a lot of ways, and it's in a way I can't wait to run the next like Star Wars or Dungeons and Dragons game, because I'm gonna have to, and I really want you to run one now, because
see, and I don't.
yeah,
I think that's been part of my concern is I don't know. The way that I think of a DM running a game is describing the visual environment that you're in. Well, I got nothing, so I can't explain it to you.
But you're going to start with a pre-published module, which we've already picked out. So
right,
and what it comes down to is, can you be a good storyteller? I know you can be a good storyteller.
Yeah,
we can fill in the rest. Because let's just take Critical Role. I mean, how often does Matt go, so tell us what that looks like? So leverage your players. I mean, we all know we all know what a cave is, right? We all know what a cabal is, right? You don't have to describe that.
Right.
Yeah. So it's just going to be interesting. But yeah, perception. How do people have? What is it? We'll end with this. The biggest problem with communication is the assumption that it happened.